In 1879, a 16-year-old boy leaves his father's farm behind for the city of Detroit at a time when the only means of transportation were trains or horse carriages, and the first automobiles were seen as racing machines for the rich. This boy who would open his own car company and completely change the automobile industry to what we know today. 35 years later, after his arrival in Detroit, half of all the cars on Earth would bear his name, and that boy Henry Ford would become one of the richest men in American history. This is his story. Henry Ford was born on his father's farm on July 30, 1863 in what is now Dearborn, Michigan. His father William Ford owned a farm where everyone in the family lived and worked, and being the eldest of 6 children, Henry was expected to take over his father's business. However, he was nothing like his father and was never interested in his business at the time. The field work was slow and rigorous and labor-intensive, while Henry did his best to help his father in the field. He really hated being there. "I never had any love for the farm. It was my mother on the farm who I loved." Henry. He also did not like school, and like many children at his age, he did not study beyond high school. He preferred to learn on his own, and from a very young age he became very interested in mechanics. This curiosity for machines led him to study every piece of machinery that he had. When he was 12 years old, his father gave him a pocket watch, and after studying its movements, he learned to disassemble and assemble it in just a few minutes, just like the watches of his friends and relatives. This earned him a reputation as a repairman of clocks, as he fixed the clocks of the townspeople. When Henry turned 13, he encountered a steam engine for the first time in his life during a school trip to one of the companies in Detroit, and that was when his passion for mechanics became an obsession, and for the next few years it was his new hobby. By the time he was 15, Henry had already built his first steam engine. But Henry's life changed when he lost his mother, Mary Ford, to a sudden illness. Henry had shared a deep bond with his mother and was closer to her than anyone else on the farm. Devastated and hurt, Henry's hatred for the farm increased, and he began to look for ways to escape from there, as it contained too many memories of his beloved mother. After turning 16 and against his father's wishes, Henry packed his things and left town in search of a new direction in his life. Music. At that time, Detroit was quickly becoming an industrial city thanks to the steam engine, and the city needed young engineers for work. It was here in Detroit that Henry immersed himself in learning everything there was about machines and engines. He found work on the street as a mechanic in a car shop known as Michigan Car Company Works, but he was fired just days after he started. After a while of being unemployed, he found work as an apprentice at the James Flower & Brothers machine shop, where he earned $60 a week. But this did not pay for the rent, so Henry made good use of his childhood obsession and found a job night as a jeweler, cleaning and repairing watches 6 hours a night and 6 days a week for 3 weeks. Despite having so many jobs at that time, Henry continued studying and experimenting with machines whenever he had time. But by 1882, when he turned 19, Henry Ford decided to return home to his family. Henry still hated the farm and worked very little there, as he spent most of his time playing and experimenting with the machines he found in the field. For his good luck, his father had bought a portable steamer, which quickly became a norm among the peasants. Henry spent most of his time with this machine and became so good with it that a villager paid him $3 to repair his steam engine, and since then the talent in Ford's gift for machines spread throughout Michigan. News of Henry's talent reached the Schenectady district representative of the Westinghouse Engine Company from New York, and the company hired him. Clara Jane Bryant at a New Year's Eve party, and they married that following year. As a wedding gift, his father gave him 40 acres of land, but instead to turn it into farmland. Henry already had other ideas. In 1891, Henry and Clara moved to a small apartment in Detroit. At that time, Henry came across a British magazine and learned about the gasoline engine. This so-called gasoline engine was being produced in small quantities by a German engineer called Nicholas Otto, and it was very different and much more efficient than steam engines. On the one hand, it did not need 30 minutes to start because the engine did all the combustion it needed internally. Although this new engine was becoming very popular quickly in Europe, only a few people had heard of it in the United States, and Henry was one of them. To his good luck, he found someone in town who had one. Henry immediately fell in love with the gasoline engine, but couldn't understand how Henry knew everything there was to know about steam engines, but he knew nothing about electricity. Knowing that he had to learn more about it, Henry requested I worked as a night engineer for the Edison Illuminating Company for a salary of $0 a month. At the time, this company was the largest electric company in Detroit and generated electricity for 1,000 homes in the city using a steam engine, so it made Henry more than qualified to work there. His job was mainly to repair the motor whenever it failed or had a problem, but as long as it ran well, he didn't have much else to do. This gave Henry more than enough time to dive in and learn about electricity and how it worked. In 1893, Henry and Clara welcomed their first and only child, Edsel Bryant Ford, and just 3 months after his birth, Henry was promoted to the position of senior engineer with a salary of $100 per week. That same year, Henry managed to create his first engine-working gasoline engine, which was the first step in his dream of creating a horseless carriage. It was not until June 4, 1896, at exactly 1:30 a.m. when he finally completed his experimental automobile with a gasoline engine and called it the quadricycle. That quadricycle was essentially a crude contraption consisting of 2 bicycles placed side by side and powered by a gasoline engine. The experiment was successful but came with a few quirks. This experimental car had no brakes and could not reverse either, but the biggest problem was which had no cooling system, therefore the car was prone to overheating after running for a while. Henry made several adjustments to the car, but the most notable was adding a cooling system to the vehicle. He then sold the vehicle for $200 and used money for its next big project, Detroit. Henry began to build a second experimental automobile and completed it in July 1899. This new automobile was heavier, larger and stronger than the previous one. One morning, Henry took it to a rich lumber merchant named William Murphy to take a test drive in their new car. When they finished driving, William wanted to be part of Henry's business company, and shortly after they shook hands, and on August 5, 1899, the Detroit Automobile Company was born. Unfortunately, the company failed for just 1 year. Year later, for certain reasons, Henry's ideas to improve the automobile they built did not coincide with the ideas of the investors who pressured him to manufacture passenger cars. Another reason was that most of the parts that were required to manufacture his cars were produced by different companies, and as a result, every time a delivery was delayed, the entire factory had to stop and wait for the delivery. This took a lot of time away from production. His first car, which he called the delivery wagon, took 6 months to build and only 20 of them were manufactured. During the first 2 years of the company's existence, as a result of all this, Henry was fired from his position, but even though his first company had failed, he remained optimistic. Failure is simply the opportunity to start over, this time in a smarter way. In a way, Henry was relieved when he was fired because there was less pressure on him and he could now focus on other things. Henry decided to focus his attention on racing cars. The reason was simple: racing cars had become a very popular sport in the United States, and Henry wanted a platform to showcase his cars and quality. In addition, despite knowing many people in the city, many of them were not willing to invest in his ideas after what happened with the Detroit Automobile Company. 1 year later, the new car, the racing car that Ford designed, defeated the vehicle of Cleveland automaker Alexander Winton, who was the country's leading national racing driver. Henry's 26-horsepower vehicle became famous around the city, and that kind of popularity gave the investors the confidence they needed to back Henry a second time. The result was the birth of Ford Motor Company with Henry as senior engineer, but not long after, Henry's position was again at risk. The reason was because Henry continued working in the manufacturing of racing cars, which angered their investors. They wanted Henry to create passenger cars that they could sell to the crowd, so they they brought in another Henry Martin Leland, to do their bidding. Ford was enraged because they had hired someone else to take his place for when he left the company. In his autobiography, Henry is quoted as saying, "I resigned, determined never to put myself under orders again." On the other hand, Henry Leland followed the wishes of his investors and created what is today Cadillac. With Henry Ford leaving the name of the company, he switched from Ford Motor Company AC Cadillac Motor Company. Henry and a former racing cyclist named Tom Cooper continued building racing cars. In 1902 they designed the Ford 990 by Barney Oldfield, a former bicycle racer who had never driven a car in his lifetime, against a passing Winton's car. In 1904 Henry's new car broke all American records by driving at a top speed of 147 kilometers per hour. With these records and victories, Henry had established himself as the greatest American designer of automobiles. Career. With that kind of reputation, he knew that investors would support him again when he was ready to start his third company with the support and financial backing of 11 investors, especially that of a coal distributor in Detroit named Alexander Young Malcolmson. Henry's third company was born. The company was initially called Ford and Malcolmson Limited, but it was later changed to Ford Motor Company in 1902. After failing in its first two attempts, Henry was determined not to fail again. Ford focused his attention on creating a vehicle that was accessible to the common man. At that time, having a vehicle was a luxury that only the rich could afford. The reason was that these vehicles were manufactured by extremely qualified engineers, and most of the cars manufactured were strictly for racing. At the beginning of his new company, Henry made a statement to his friends, partners and investors: "I will build a car for the great multitude, built of the best materials by the best men, hired with the simplest designs that modern engineering can devise, so low in price that no man making a good salary cannot buy." Henry Ford, he had a good knack for identifying and attracting the most talented men in the business. He hired several bright young men who shared and believed in his vision for car design. Henry created more than 20 of them until he finally got one that worked and called it the Model A. Over the next 5 years, Henry continued to improve Model A and then continued with Model N. But in those 5 years, what really changed was not the improvements to his designs, but how they were being created. One of the things Henry learned from his businesses failed was the importance of having a manufacturer responsible for supplying most of the parts he needed to build his cars. This way he found a machine shop in Detroit to do just that. One day during a trip to Chicago, Henry witnessed the line concept assembly in a slaughterhouse, and it was then when a brilliant idea occurred to him. If he could incorporate the same idea in the construction of his cars, he could make more cars in a day. At that time, Ford and many other automobile manufacturers assembly experiment with the assembly line within its new factory. It was not until 1906 that Model N production actually made use of the assembly line for the first time. But even then, the assembly line was still a work in progress. However, it increased the level of production fivefold, and its new model became the best-selling automobile in the United States. But Henry had set his sights on even greater things: his own manufacturing company in 1905 to begin manufacturing his own engines, transmissions, and everything necessary for the production of his automobiles. Around this time, Henry also discovered Alban steel, and it was this discovery that really opened the way to a new era for the automobile industry. Alban steel was about 3 times stronger than the previous steel and much lighter. Henry used this new steel for his new model that will later become one of the most successful cars in history, the Model T. A business absolutely dedicated to service will only have a concern for profits will be embarrassingly large. Henry Ford dreamed of manufacturing cars for the common man and for the daily use, and the Model T was the answer to the dream. When it was first launched, the price of the Model T was $850, which would be about $2,000 in today's currency. But despite its price, it quickly became a favorite of fans in the United States. Within days of its release, 15,000 orders were placed, and Ford Motor Company was officially operational in 1913. This allowed work to be moved in and around the vehicle. That vehicle was dragged down the line, building it step by step, and the new process reduced production time from 12 hours to 90 minutes. By 1914, its production rate of of over 300,000 vehicles, surpassed all cars produced by other car manufacturers combined between 1910 and 1916. The number of model cars produced rose from 20,000 to almost 1 million by then, approximately half of all cars on Earth were Fords. However, Henry had another plan that would make him stand out in the world automobile market. Each year the production quantity of the Model T increased, so it reduced the price of the automobile. In fact, in 1916 the price of the Model T that once sold for $850 was now selling for less than $400. By 1918 half of all the cars in the United States were Model Ts, but that was not the only brilliant strategy that Henry adopted. Even though Henry pioneered the automobile era in the United States with the assembly line, many of his workers were not happy with this innovation. Many employees found it boring to do the same thing over and over again, and the skilled craftsmen among them found their new job insulting, as they were given only 2 tasks instead of building the complete car. As a result, workers began to leave Ford to work with other companies. To combat this, Henry doubled the workers' salary, raising it to $5 per day. Many companies laughed at this move, believing that it would bankrupt the company, but he did the opposite. Mechanics from all over the county flew to Detroit in search of higher wages. Henry Ford. Not only did he increase the wages of the mechanics who now worked for him, but he also gave them an hour off from the number of hours they had to work. The shift change allowed Ford to hire a new group of workers for a third shift and create an operation 24 hours. Very soon many other car companies had to do the same for fear of losing their workers to Ford. Henry had changed the world of business and manufacturing in the United States. There is one rule for the industrialist, and that is to make goods of the best possible quality at the lowest possible cost, paying the highest possible wages. In 1919 Henry grew tired of the interference of other investors in the company and decided to buy them all. The result was several millionaires in Detroit, but he also made Henry Ford the sole owner of the largest car company in the world. Henry later appointed Ethel Ford's 26-year-old son as president of his company, but it was Henry who really continued to run the show. However, absolute power over the company came at a price that not even the richest and most successful man in America could ignore. Henry continued to believe that the Model T was the car most people wanted. He ignored the growing popularity of like the Chevrolet. Being a foolish man and stubborn that he was, he refused to listen to other Ford executives or even his own son Edsel when they said it was time for a new model. In the late 1920s Henry couldn't ignore the falling sales figures, so he finally decided to close assembly line and began designing a completely new car. The new Model A was launched in 1927, but this new car was no longer produced in Highland Park, but in a larger factory at Robb River in Michigan. In his new factory, Henry wanted all the steps involved in the manufacturing process, from the refining of the primary materials to the final assembly of the automobile, which Henry managed to convert his factory into the largest in the world, producing steel, glass, wheels and other components for cars. However, the control Ford's absolute decision-making was no longer the formula for success, and by 1936 Ford Motor Company had fallen to third place in the American market behind General Motors and Chrysler Corporation, even with Henry's latest design of the 8-cylinder engine. It wasn't enough, things just went from bad to worse, and with the onset of the Great Depression, Ford was forced to lay off workers and reduce their pay. In 1943, Henry's son died of stomach cancer, so he continued running the company. During the years, Henry's son died of stomach cancer. Before handing over control of Ford Motor Company to his grandson Henry I, Henry 00 retired from the company and then died of a brain hemorrhage on April 7, 1947. Life is a series of experiences, each of which makes us bigger, although sometimes it is difficult to realize it because the world was built to develop character, and we must learn that the setbacks and sorrows we endure help us move forward. Today Ford Motor Company has a stock value sum of around $50,000 million and is still one of the largest automotive companies in the world. Thank you for staying until the end. Make sure to subscribe and like the video with me. It will be until next time.